Xabi Alonso, if he were to leave Leverkusen this summer, should he go to Liverpool or Bayern Munich? Well, today I'm joined by Bull, Jon Mackenzie and Seb Stafford-Bloor to discuss exactly that. JJ, set the stage for us at these various different clubs. If Alonso was to join Bayern or Liverpool this summer, or indeed stay at Leverkusen, what are the challenges awaiting him?
Well, he would face many challenges at each of the individual clubs, and what I've done is looked at the pros and cons of each of those and what he might face in the short term, starting with Liverpool. So if he were to go to Liverpool, what he'd join straight away is they've got a great squad and a winning team, it's obviously very important, and he'd be able to compete with the very best in the Premier League, because that's where all the best managers are, and I think competitive people like to do that. And also the expectations at Liverpool are somewhat achievable because it's so competitive that you're not expected to win the league every single year, nor win the Champions League. But if you compete at high level, then it's acceptable as long as you play nice football. And they should be able to do that because they have the players for it and they're already doing it. The cons of Liverpool is that they're coming to the end of an era, which is very, very important. It's something we'll touch on quite a lot soon. It's very relevant, that bit. And also, some of the key players are ageing. So you've got Mo Salah, Van Dijk, people like that. They'll need to be replaced at some point. And that's maybe a long-term rebuild. It depends how much control Alonso has and what the structure is like at the club at the time. Also, the other con of Liverpool is that Pep Guardiola is still in the Premier League while he's there. It's very hard to win things. So these are things he might consider. Is it the right time to go there? Whereas if he goes to Bayern Munich, for example, well, they've got, by God, don't you know, they've got great players, great individual players, a lot of them going about. They also would have no real rivals in the league, especially if Alonso were to join them, because he is the rival. So that's a benefit to him, and it means he'd probably win trophies, which is very useful. Many
of his players at Leverkusen may also depart in the summer, so that kind of reduces the quality.
Well, absolutely, and he might take some of them with him.
Sure.
Well, although Bayern sort of buy players themselves, don't they? They buy it for the manager. Well, whatever they do, he'd be expected to win the league like everyone else does. And he'd be able to compete for the Champions League realistically because he'd be a core of players that is good enough to do that, but not expected to. So again, the pressure is very high and you have to compete very highly in the Champions League with Bayern Munich, but you don't expect it to win it straight away. The cons are that Bayern Munich are currently quite vulnerable, like a wounded giant. And so everyone wants to attack that giant and hurt the giant. Also, at Bayern Munich, you get no time to build. So if the team has great individual players, but the team's not as cohesive as maybe you want it to be, and people are finding weaknesses and it's not quite there, it needs a bit of work, but you get no time to build. And I went through all the Bayern Munich managers, I think back to Jupp Heynckes the first time he was there. And what you have to do as a Bayern Munich manager is get over 2.4 points per game to be able to be considered a success. If you get lower than 2.4 points per game, you're not a success, even if you win the league.
That's quite a lot, given that you can only win 3 in a game.
Well, that is correct. And then what you have with Bayern Munich, especially, is that 2.4 points per game has to also be done by playing in a certain way, like an attacking way that people are entertained by. Otherwise, like Niko Kovac won the league, right? But no one remembers Kovac. Was he good, Seb?
Not really.
No. See, there you go. That's what you do.
That's the point, right? You can win the Bundesliga with Bayern and still be considered a failure.
Absolutely. You have to compete in everything, but do it in the right way. And also, to compare that to Liverpool, where I worked out the same thing. Since Kenny Dalglish in 1985, you have to win 1.8 points per game to be deemed a success.
How do you work that out?
I did the points per game that they've won, and then averaged that.
Right. Okay. But how do you define who was a success and who wasn't?
By ones I think were good.
Right.
And then looked at what they had, and then with the successful ones like Klopp or Kenny Dalglish or others in that list. Right. So I mean, Gerard Houllier would be considered a success, I would think, at Liverpool. Same as Rafa Benitez would be considered a success, and they're about 1.8 points per game.
Right. Okay.
My final con of Bayern Munich, which is that the expectations are incredible, almost impossible to hit. It's impossible to win every single game, but you're expected to. You have to win every single game. Something that people find, especially in Scotland, if you manage Celtic or Rangers. If you don't win every single game, you're a failure, basically.
The media is only really interested in Bayern Munich in Germany as well. Like in England, you've got Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester United, Man City, Liverpool, and the media's focus is spread pretty evenly between them. In Germany, Bayern Munich is the only story in town, and everybody else is kind of item 7 on the news headlines.
That's kind of what Xavi's talked about in Spain, and people talk about Real Madrid as well, is that the pressure on these massive super clubs is enormous because they are the football teams in the league, right? So that's the kind of conjugate of Bayern Munich. If you go there, you've got to consider all that, but you could go there for 2-3 years and get spat out. But why doesn't he just stay at Bayer Leverkusen? He's got a good thing going. He has a great team that he can build on with his own style, and there's no real pressure because Bayer Leverkusen shouldn't be where they are at the moment. So there's room to learn there as well and keep developing his style and really work out what he wants to do. You can't really play with tactical styles and things you think might work at a super club, because if it goes wrong, then you're out. The cons of Bayer Leverkusen, though, obviously, is that right now they are overachieving. So they are performing way above expectations. It's probably going to regress to the mean. And also, all those players who are doing so well for them are probably going to get sold, probably to Bayern Munich. Also, the other con of Bayer Leverkusen is that Bayern just dominate the league anyway.
Yeah.
So if you don't go now, you only get a certain amount of time at these clubs like Leverkusen when your reputation's really high to capitalise on that. If
You
it were
had
to
your
fall
historic
apart,
moment. If you wait until next summer, do you still have the same number of options?
well, if he stays and it's not as good next season and they finish maybe third or fourth, is it that impressive anymore?
Yeah.
So you want to keep your reputation really high and make sure you can go to other jobs afterwards. But there's lots of cons and pros to both. And that's what he's going to inherit wherever he goes.
I think the last one is a really good point as well, John, about like explaining why short-term thinking is important. Because obviously Alonso will be thinking about his career longer term as well. But there's a scenario where he might not even be able to make a decision with the options that he has this summer, next summer, if he would stay.
Yeah, the long term is completely tied up with the short term, particularly in the modern game. Because I think if you're going to have a decent chunk of a career at any club now, you have to hit the ground running. There's so few, particularly elite clubs, who are going to be patient with a manager for long enough for them to actually become good. So I think that it's important for him to focus on the short term when he's considering his long term options, because we have seen managers fail on that front before. There's plenty of coaches who've started out badly and not gone on to be remembered. I think the classic example here is probably Mikel Arteta, right? He starts out quite badly, and there's a possible world out there where Arteta gets fired by Arsenal before he can hit the heights that he's hitting at the moment. But there's, I guess, closer to home, Andoni Iraola at the beginning of this season in the Premier League had 9 games where Bournemouth were really underperforming, and there was talk of him getting sacked at that point, and then they went on a really incredible run. Now people are talking about him as one of the exciting managers in the Premier League. So again, short-term impacts definitely play into the longer-term prospects of coaches as well.
I've actually mapped out what it might look like for Alonso in his entire career. As you can see, this comprehensive pipe chart. Very clear to follow, easy to follow, I would say.
Talk us through this, JJ.
Well, depending on where he starts off, he's got different career options that all should end with being the best manager ever, because that's probably presumably what he wants to do,
That's
right?
everyone's ambition.
Everyone. So if you go to Bayern, you win stuff, you escape because it's 2 or 3 years and you get spat out. You go to Liverpool, then you can build for longer because you can last longer at Liverpool. They give you about 5 to 6 years. Then you go to Real Madrid, you'll want to do that as well at some point, the biggest club in the world. Win, escape national team, then you become the best manager in the world. But if you fail at one of these, like Bayern Munich, you get put into this randomizer here where you start getting put into other clubs where you get stuck in this little circle. Maybe you'll have success and go to a team like Real Madrid who want someone at the time.
Sure.
But generally, you need to take advantage of yourself at the highest reputation point. Otherwise, you might not get to have fun and become the best manager ever, and instead be stuck in this bit, which is where everyone else tends to live.
And what it is in that bit in the middle, you've got to find a revival project to move that blocker back up to where Leverkusen were to get back into it's like a pinball machine.
That's exactly right. And if you study this, you'll see that it's absolutely perfect and there's no flaws in it.
Yeah.
I like to read it from the bottom to the top. So you start with the best manager ever, and you can't ever not end up at Alonso. So,
that's quite good, isn't it? Yeah. Look at that. Flipping the narrative around there. Well done. Well done. I mean, JJ mentioned this before, Seb Stafford-Bloor, but replacing a very successful long-term manager at a Super League level club, it's no mean feat, is it? So if we were to assume for a moment that Liverpool does interest Alonso as an option, what do you think are some of the immediate challenges I'm thinking of David Moyes.
You're thinking of David Moyes, but actually this is a problem which presents in several different ways, Joe. So I've got 4 examples of how legacy managers were replaced and it went wrong afterwards. So Moyes is a great example, and everyone knows that. So you've got the load-bearing central figure of Ferguson, who really became the definition of the club by the time he retired. And then you replace that with an employee who isn't ever going to fill that kind of space. He's not going to spread out into the different areas and the vacuums. So what you end up having to do is you've got your manager, and then you have to build a technical structure around him once he's in situ to replace what you've lost. And that's kind of the classic problem. But there are loads of others. So probably the other great long-term manager of the Premier League era was Arsene Wenger at Arsenal. When he left, obviously Wenger, a great romantic of the game, had a belief system that he would never waver from, to a fault, obviously, in the eyes of a lot of Arsenal fans. Unai Emery comes in to replace him, and Emery's a technocrat, a very, very good coach. He's been very, very successful in his own right. But then when he came in, instead of kind of the romantic side of the game, he tried to force on his players a more technical analysis. And so what you'd hear in the media were kind of leaked stories about, oh God, we've had to sit through 5 hours of video analysis and we're bored. And, you're trying to coach a group of players that have got used to one approach and then, had to adapt. And
where's Wenger's poetry gone?
Where has all the poetry gone? Situation 3. So a bit more abstract and tenuous here, but Mauricio Pochettino at Spurs. So had a very kind of altruistic approach to squad harmony and was very sociable with his players. And if you hear a lot of them talk about him, it's like they're describing a father or an uncle or a brother.
A young paternal figure.
A little bit, yeah. And so when Pochettino goes, he's succeeded by Mourinho, who historically and to this day is much more confrontational. So Mourinho wants to provoke improvement by prodding players and poking them and kind of finding weaknesses and curing them.
A different kind of family figure.
Very much. And the result and consequence of that for a club is, because you've got all these players who are sort of loyal and used to one style of management, you have to kind of replace all of them, really. You have to get rid of your core, and most clubs, and Liverpool probably fall into this category, you don't have the cash to make that scale of change.
Yeah.
And lastly, the last one is an interesting one. So Pep Guardiola at Barcelona, when he left and he was replaced by Carlo Ancelotti, very much in the kind of the Niko Kovac style of Bayern Munich successes.
Yeah.
So you go from Guardiola's incredible attention to detail and almost like micromanaging, like insatiable desire to control everything that's going on at the football club all at the same time, to Ancelotti, who's a much more laid-back character. And so when you have a group of players who are used to one thing, again, suddenly they start to miss the lack of control, and the environment starts to feel loose. And generally speaking, almost always, performance suffers.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that the question in this specific instance is whether Alonso could buck that trend at Liverpool. I mean, we discussed this earlier as that trend almost feeling as though if a manager is very successful and is at a Super League level club for a long time, it's almost inevitable that they will draw more power to their role over that long period. They probably outlive other people, senior members of the club too. And inevitably, like you mentioned before, you have a younger manager or a less experienced manager or any manager come in and replace them. They're more of an employee. They can't possibly fill that void. So it could just be that this is always doomed to fail. I suppose the question then is, specifically with Alonso, can he buck that historical trend? Guide us through this conversation.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it's not the case that it's just not possible. And I think there are 4 areas which, 4 main pitfalls that he faces, 4 challenges he's going to overcome. The first, obviously, he'd be walking into a very strong Premier League. So you've got 3 title challenges, but also outside of that, you've got an awful lot of very well-money contenders for Champions League places. So like, for instance, John, if you had a slow start, which he did at Leverkusen, it's not like in the Bundesliga where you can kind of have a soft landing in 3rd or 4th. You're going to fall behind not just, Manchester City and Arsenal, but potentially
Aston Villa,
Spurs, Man United, a resurgent Chelsea. All of these teams are in the conversation. You could find yourself in 7th.
Yeah.
It'd be very, very difficult.
Yeah, if you've got 3 challenging teams for Premier League for the Premier League title, that means you've probably only got 1 or 2 spots open for Champions League, and then good contenders there as well.
Absolutely, and what we've seen historically is the Premier League really punishes down years for good teams. You find yourself in Chelsea's situation or Manchester United's, really adrift. The second thing is communication. Like, they're very different people. Alonso is very authoritative on the training ground. He's a real statesman of the game, speaks a million languages perfectly, so he's a really good communicator, but not in the Klopp sense, which kind of builds this kind of fraternal atmosphere around a football club and enraptures fans. It's not quite the same. And so you can imagine, for instance, like you'll remember like the atmosphere at Anfield for big European games or those big games against Guardiola's City. Do you remember like how frenzied that all was? Like,
he almost makes it like a 12th man.
He does indeed, but this is what he talked about when he got the job. He wanted to animate the Anfield atmosphere, and he did that. Alonso, not quite the same guy.
I think that's really important. I think he does represent a lot of what that city is.
Nail on the head,
doesn't he?
Yeah.
Nail on the head, right? Because also a forgotten thing is like how similar Dortmund and Liverpool are as places and cities. Like there are differences, but in terms of kind of what's important to people and the history of the place, there are similarities. Klopp knows how to deal with that, but
he's
also
almost like the lead fan of Liverpool.
Absolutely, and rightly so, like because he has that connection with supporters. So Alonso, not to say won't have it, but it's a variable, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting because I think what you're looking for in coaches is leadership, right? And tacticians like myself might downplay that, but a big part of why Jurgen Klopp's been so successful has been his leadership. Now, that's not to say that Xabi Alonso isn't a leader also. He clearly is.
Yes.
But that leadership is very different. It's based around almost like a quiet confidence that he is in the place where he belongs to be. He's been his whole life in those kind of places before. He knows how to behave in those places. That will give the players a confidence themselves, but it is a very different type of leadership from what Jurgen Klopp has been.
I mean, speaking of places as well, I can see your third point here.
Yes,
you've
indeed.
kindly written it down for me, Seb. Lack of footballing structure, John, at Liverpool relative to Bayern Munich. That might be difficult for him as well.
Yeah, but we mentioned it before, particularly with respect to Ferguson, that when you have these dynasty managers, they end up right at the top of the pile, and everything sort of flows out of them. And you could make the argument actually. Jurgen Klopp leaving now is pretty good for Liverpool because they were in danger of becoming that kind of club where it was way too top heavy. But that does mean that with Alonso coming in from a club which is very well structured into a club where maybe they're going to be working on some of the structures behind the scenes, particularly in terms of recruitment and in terms of the data side of things as well, could be pretty tricky for him to actually have to work through some of the growing pains of those developments.
Something interesting I saw in the summer was I went to the Leverkusen training camp in Saalfelden in Austria, and after each session they held, Alonso had a little chat with Fernando Caro, chief executive, and Simon Rolfs, the board director for sport. And it's very interesting how like entwined all those characters are and how cohesive the relationship is. And I really think that's going to be important. So, and that's another point of comparison, Joe, because you've got at Bayern Munich, have kind of rejigged their structure. So Christoph Freund has come in as sporting director. Above him, Max Abel, who had a very unhappy year at Leipzig, but was previously long-term sporting director at Borussia Mönchengladbach. He's just started work a couple of weeks ago. So they have this structure with a vacancy, a hole for a manager just to be dropped in. Liverpool feels a bit more fluid. So over the past couple of years, Michael Edwards, long gone, obviously, the sporting director who was considered one of the architects of the successful Premier League European Cup winning side. He's gone. Julian Ward, who was supposed to be his replacement, didn't last very long. He's gone. Jörg Schmadtke, he left at the beginning of the year in January. He was there for a very short period of time. So you cycle through a lot of guys, a lot of philosophies, a lot of different instincts about how you should progress. And you're looking at a Liverpool summer where they're being connected with Richard Hughes, who was the Bournemouth sporting director, Tim Steiden, who works currently for West Ham, who's previously worked under Simon Rolfs at Leverkusen. It's all a bit uncertain. And so if you're a coach, you're going into a position potentially where you're not really appointed by the people who you work with. You don't maybe know who the people you're going to work with are, and it's going to be kind of built around you. That's a little bit, not of a red flag, but that's an inconvenience.
And that's one of the biggest things that United got wrong with the Moyes thing, was the recruitment. Obviously, like David Gill left at exactly the same time, right? But if you look at the recruitment that Man United had after, when Moyes came in, they signed Fellaini on like the last day of the window and stuff. Then the recruitment in the window was
forget about that as well, is that Everton's asking price for Fellaini was lower at the beginning of the summer, and then his buyout clause came into effect. So not even just that they bought him right at the end, but they paid more for him than they would have done if they bought him 4 weeks earlier.
I mean, the individual negotiations were poor, and I think everyone realises that now, especially in hindsight. But the actual recruitment, the players they brought in didn't suit anyone. There was no cohesion. And it points to the same thing like when Wenger left Arsenal and when Unai Emery came in, then the recruitment wasn't exactly perfect either going forward, lack of cohesion. And then you have Liverpool now, like Seb's saying, without that person in charge of it, Klopp's mostly dealt with the transfers that's come in, it looks like, so he's built a team in his image. And that's one of the things that you might have. To say that, Alonso will be able to work with any group of players he inherits.
Yeah, I think he would, and there's one more point which I think is probably equally true at both clubs, in that you've got a really strong core. In Bayern's case, worked under several managers and won a lot. In Liverpool's case, I think the problem is a little bit more complex, because you've got this big group who have not only won a lot with Klopp, but also have a kind of loyalty to him in the sense that his football and the team that he built helped them to become individual stars in their own right.
Well, so no one predates Klopp in the playing squad, right? Exactly
that. And if you think about the really big characters within it, Virgil van Dijk, Mohamed Salah, Andy Robertson, Trent Alexander-Arnold, even guys like, Alisson the goalkeeper, but Konate, Jota, that's difficult because you have that situation. I think we can all relate to it. It's not a football thing. You go in and you work under a new boss. Well, that's not the way it used to work.
I think it would benefit. I honestly think it would be benefiting because you'd have that core group of leaders already. So like a lot of the stuff you have to do with motivation and leadership is already, the standards are already set on the training ground. Yeah. As long as they maintain that core and then build underneath
you
it.
get three people to buy in, the rest follow suit.
Yeah, exactly.
But do you remember that situation that always used to recur at Chelsea? So you'd have kind of new managers coming in post Mourinho, and it wasn't quite right for Cech, Lampard, Terry, Drogba, and unless you can kind of convince them pretty quickly, it goes wrong really quickly. And so it's
high stakes.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. Yes.
I think as well, the big tactical problem that Liverpool have been trying to solve this season is how do you fit Trent Alexander-Arnold and Mohamed Salah into the same team? And you know, with Salah getting older, I think this is just a really nice opportunity for Liverpool to say, what do we want our football to look like in the future? Let's bring in a manager who can build a team around Trent Alexander-Arnold.
Okay, so we've talked about the teams in situ right now. What about the longer term, John?
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about looking at managers who've had long dynastic careers at clubs, the thing that unites them is that usually they have this a very clear tactical identity, which they are able to instill in the clubs that they're at, and it almost becomes part of the club's own identity. So we've talked about Jurgen Klopp a lot. We've also talked about Pep Guardiola. Both of those coaches have come into their respective clubs with very clear tactical ideas, and you know, Jurgen Klopp's aggressive, high-pressing, direct football has now become synonymous with what Liverpool are. Pep Guardiola, similarly, this sort of really patient positional game with Cruyffian influences, which has, I guess, leaned into this idea of like total control. That's what Manchester City are now. So I think when we're talking about the longer term impact of Xabi Alonso and maybe the clubs that he'll work at, we have to talk about what his tactical identity is. And we don't have a huge amount of data to really base that on, right? Because he's been at Leverkusen for a season and a half. He was in youth systems in Spain before that. And I think when we talk about Alonso, and managers in general, to be honest, it's so easy to fall into the trap of saying, what formation are they playing?
Yeah.
Xabi Alonso is playing this 3-4-3 that you can see on the board. And this isn't necessarily a particularly popular formation in world football, certainly not at the highest level. So a lot of people will say something like, well, how can this possibly work at Liverpool? Liverpool play a 4-3-3 variant, so this won't work. But
that is the kind of thing I would think and say.
Exactly, and we should avoid that at all costs, thinking like you. What I think is actually more important is the principles that are underlying behind the structures that he has in place. So let's talk a little bit about what he's trying to do in possession with the ball. Now, the basic thing with in possession football is that you want to move the ball usually down the field into a more dangerous goal-scoring situation. That's the very basic idea.
It's part of the rules as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Effective tactic.
I would say that as well.
Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about is sub-principles here. So I would say there's two very specific phases in what Xabi Alonso is trying to do with the ball. And what distinguishes those two sub-phases is tempo. So what he's wanting to do at the very beginning, when they're building up from the back, is they want to get control of the ball. They want to have the ball in such a way that they can then build an attack from it. And the way that they do that is they implement the basic ideas that every modern coach is going to use when they're trying to build up from the back. What you want to do is you want to develop overloads, so you have more players than the opposition because it's easier to keep the ball that way. The other thing you want to do is generate as much space as possible, because the more space that you have when you're building up, the harder it is for opposition players to press you. So what they do when they're building out of the back, actually they push Jeremy Frimpong really high up the pitch. Jeremy Frimpong, you'll often see him almost playing like a striker.
Him and Grimaldo have scored loads of goals and assists this season.
They have, yeah. They're really, really important form of production for Leverkusen. But what pushing Frimpong forward does is it creates this space now for Kasunu to move into basically a de facto fullback. You can then split your two centre-backs, and let's imagine that the opposition then are pressing out as out of a 4-4-2 shape, like many elite teams do. What you've done here is you've fulfilled that first obligation of creating an overload, because we've got the goalkeeper here, two centre-backs up against that front two. We can have either one of the two sixes now dropping in to help out as well to exacerbate that overload. You can have players dropping in as well to help out as well. The other thing that it's generated is width. So we've got Grimaldo and Kasunu now playing really wide, and this just creates more space. So the opposition pressing, have more space to cover, makes it much harder to do. And the whole idea of this then is for them to be able to generate controlled possession, because when you're kicking the ball off, you don't actually have settled possession, as we call it, because the opposition have a really nice chance to try and win the ball back, which is why teams like to press high. But because you've got all of these advantages now in build-up, the idea is that you can work the ball out, the opposition can't press you, and you're going to force them back deeper into their own half through this nice controlled, settled possession with your players all pushing up the field. So that's the first phase. And as I said, the second phase is now characterized by a change of tempo. So nice and patient build up to get into these situations where you now have the ball and you can start thinking about how we're going to generate these more dangerous attacking moments. And the way that they're going to do that is by trying to work the ball through lines of pressure. So you can see here in a 4-4-2 shape, 3 lines of pressure. What they're going to try and do is get the ball into these kind of areas in front of the defence. You've got the attackers running towards the opposition back line. That's really hard to defend. And as you can see, we've got players like Florian Wirtz. Hoffmann can come inside because Frimpong's pushing up. You now have lots of really exciting players in that kind of area. So you want to try and get the ball to them, but you also want to try and get the ball to them quite quickly, because the quicker that you attack, the more space there's going to be. If you are slow building up, then everything's going to just compress down. It's going to be harder to break down that low block. And the way that Leverkusen are going to try and move the ball into these areas is by using what we call third man combinations. So you see this happening a lot with Leverkusen. What they're going to do is they're going to overload players, particularly in the middle, get all these players into channels, and they're going to try and play quick passing movements to get the ball through lines of pressure. Now, the most simple third man combination is passing to one player who can then pass to another player. But one of the other things that we see actually happening quite a lot with Leverkusen is they use I guess you could call it an A-B-A-C passing combination. So A is the first player who passes it to B, and he can do a bounce pass back. Yeah. And the idea here is that you're drawing in opposition players to respond to that first pass. That ball gets played back, and then you'll have, in this instance, Tapsoba then playing it through to Palacios, who can then find the space in behind that's been opened out here.
D,
yes, yeah. A-B-A-C-D.
Goal.
Yeah, goal. But now what you end up with is these really quick passing combinations, short passing combinations, the players all quite close together, trying to find these channels where they can just work the ball through really quickly, and that's been a really generative way for them to actually create really dangerous chances.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that it's not so much the formation that the team starts out as, it's these other specific principles that you think you would probably see at Liverpool.
Yeah, so for example, if you look at the structure we've got here, in both of the phases of play, we're seeing basically a back four forming, right, with Frimpong pushing forward. So there's no reason why you couldn't use the same principles that we're talking about here, which is slow build-up, patient build-up, controlled possession, to then these more dynamic, quick passing plays out of a back four system. So Liverpool play a 4-3-3 system. No reason why you couldn't have the same principles at play with that different structure. So the important thing then is, how do I fit the players into the best positions for them and then adopt this style of play?
And Bayern could just sign Frimpong and Grimaldo.
I was going to say, any reason you can't do the same thing at Bayern?
Yeah, I mean, Bayern have played the 3-4-3 structure. They actually played it against Leverkusen.
I just mean his principles as opposed to the formation.
Yeah, I think Bayern well set to play this kind of football. They have the really exciting front four that get in between the lines. That's how they play anyway. But I think adding this more sort of controlled build-up with then the ability to change pace and tempo quickly would work really well for them.
You know what's really interesting to me, John? Do you remember when Thomas Müller had his rant after the Leverkusen game? He was talking about...
I didn't understand anything he said, but it was a lovely rant.
Well, basically, I mean, to paraphrase, he said, one of the differences between us is Leverkusen look like they're having fun when they play. We're so structured. And then the interviewer followed up by talking about how it was that Robert Andrich crossed for Jurgen Stanisic to score the first goal. And it was it looked very bad on TV. Stanisic was in loads of space. Stanisic is a Bayern Munich player on loan, so that didn't help.
Sure.
But he said, well, if you look back through Leverkusen's season, when have you ever seen that combination before? And this, for me, felt like one of the key things. It's really unpredictable, and this feels like why.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is modern football now. This is the way that things are moving. There's lots of criticisms that European football has become too rigid, too much based around the concept of control, to such an extent that teams are now able to prevent Manchester Cities of this world from being able to score as easily as they might want to. This is a really nice way of overcoming that, of introducing a bit more tempo, not worrying so much about complete control, because the difference between Leverkusen here and Man City is that Man City aren't wanting necessarily to always inject pace into the second and third phases of play. They're much happier just forcing the opposition back, working the ball around the edge of the box and creating in that way. So this should be very encouraging for any elite team looking for a new coach, because these are modern ideas, and I think that you've got the flexibility here as well to know that you don't necessarily need to worry about what formation Alonso's playing now. You could probably import him into your club and he would make it work within the structure that you're already playing.
To my simple mind, it sounds kind of Liverpool. I mean, how do you answer the long-term question? In your mind, is there a better long-term decision for him to make now?
I think moving to Bayern in the short term would be probably preferable for him because he already has the players to be able to do that. I think at Liverpool, yes, they are trying to play quite direct attacking football, but they're getting a lot of upside by being able to move the ball really quickly through the first phase, I would say, as much as the second and third phase.
So that's quite a change for them.
Yeah, which means that this first phase, sort of a little bit more patience, would potentially require them to rethink what they're doing a little bit. And again, we talked about Trent Alexander-Arnold before. They use Trent Alexander-Arnold as a cheat code to be able to progress the ball without having necessarily super structured first phase possession. So you could definitely fit Trent Alexander-Arnold in somewhere else in that system, but it's not the way that Liverpool have been doing it. So I think they would probably require a couple of transfer windows, maybe, to bring in the sorts of players that he would want to be able to enact this system there.
What's the best long-term decision for him if you had to pick between the three clubs?
I think he should go to Bayern for 2 years, win a bunch of stuff, and then he can go to Liverpool or wherever he wants after it. Because I think with Liverpool, it's unlikely you'd have someone who's there for 5-6 years and then you get another manager straight after who does the same thing. I think there's probably a little bit period of transition, and you could probably let someone else do that. And also, if he's quite young, right? He's like 42, I think, Alonso. So you go to Bayern now, you've got the energy to deal with all that stuff, and then you can do that, and then go to Liverpool when you're 44, 45, and then have a bit of a longer time there. Maybe build a bit of a Alonso house.
Yeah, the House of Alonso.
House of Alonso, yeah.
I mean, you have the benefit of living in Germany. Have you subsumed anything from the German public or indeed the German media about the likelihood? You would assume they think he's going to Bayern.
They're very confident. So part of this goes through the lens of the German media only really being interested in Bayern. So the idea that he might go to Liverpool is kind of over there somewhere.
Sure.
And yeah, clearly it's a very enticing prospect, marrying the best coach in the country at the moment with the most powerful side. I'd like to see him stay at Leverkusen. Just because I know about the departures and the exits, but Leverkusen are built to renew themselves. So they have Nathan Teller or Artur, who can potentially inherit a position from Jeremy Frimpong. They haven't really got the best of Amin Adli yet and Adam Hojek. So I'd like to see him take this side into the Champions League and see what happens next. That would be really interesting.
It's way more fun.
It's way more fun.
You've got to change it somehow. You can't have the same forever.
Yeah.
Or it becomes a Super League.
This is what the club is built to do. So let's see it at its best.
I think that in terms of his career, he wants to be an elite coach, right? And I think that what we see from someone like Guardiola is he very clearly went to like elite clubs very quickly and made the right decision about how to develop at an elite club. He went from Barcelona to Bayern Munich because it gave him the space to be able to, fit into another country, but the same kind of club where it's really high powered. Alonso's in the same school, I would say. He's going to want to actually go to a club where he can develop the ability to be an elite coach. He has to do that somewhere, and I think the options of Liverpool versus Bayern are very different in that respect. With Bayern, it's he's going to be given free rein to sort of develop the sort of football he wants to do with the sort of players who can play it and with a relative level of low risk, as we've talked about. Obviously, the pressure is high, but it's low risk. With Liverpool, it's a case of moving, yes, to an elite team, but an elite team who've been playing a very different type of football to a lot of other elite teams. And with all of this uncertainty that we talked about in terms of, you're replacing a big coach, they're in the process of a rebuild. I think it's just a bit more risky. I would love to see Alonso go to Liverpool because I think it would be fun, but I'm obviously not his career advisor. I think if I were his career advisor, I'd be saying go to Bayern, spend 2 or 3 years there, just learn how to work at a big club, and then you can easily pick your Liverpools, your Real Madrids later down the line.
Well, if you were his career advisor, you'd be going home hungry because you've just given the answer away for free, haven't you? Well, I guess you should avoid Liverpool then, according to everyone here. How about that?
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. With the latest transfer news and insight on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.